Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this second down-to-earth dialogue at the Laudato Si Research Institute. My name is Séverine Demelin, and I am the Director of International Development at the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall, which is a permanent private hall of study at the University of Oxford. The Laudato Si Research Institute has been set up to bring together different traditions of intellectual inquiry to respond to the most pressing socio-environmental challenges of our time, and especially to bring wisdom and religious traditions in dialogue with the social and natural sciences. And the Institute has also been set up to bring academic research in dialogue with the lives of the people it serves. And it is my great pleasure today to bring in dialogue Professor Tanya Lea and her academic work on land rights in Asia, with Lea Casimiro and her practical works on protecting land rights and indigenous culture in the Amazon. Tanya Lea is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto in Canada. She is the author of many books and articles. Her most well-known book is Land's End, Capitalist Relations on an Indigenous Frontier, where she describes the process of land dispossession of farmers in Indonesia. Her work is also a key reference for any student or scholar working on palm oil in Indonesia. So Tanya, thank you very much for being with us today. Lea Casimiro is an Amazonian activist and member of the Wapishan indigenous community in English Guyana. She works in the Quality Bilingual Education Program for Wapishan children. She attended in October 2019 the Amazon Synod in Rome, and she gathered together with Pope Francis, bishops, indigenous representatives, and other experts to find new ways for the church to accompany those living in the Amazon. She lives in a remote part of Guyana, so please bear with us if there are any issues with internet connectivity. Lea, thank you so much for being with us today and traveling to be on an internet connection. Just a few housekeeping matters before we begin. This dialogue will start with Tanya and Lea, each speaking for 10 minutes. And then there'll be an exchange between them for 10 minutes. And then we'll have 15 minutes for questions. So please write your questions in the Ask a Question section at any point during the event. So we would ask to write your questions on the Ask a Question section and not on the chat box, please. Just to say that this event is being live streamed on YouTube, and it will also be recorded so that those who are unable to attend will be able to watch it afterwards. So Tanya, over to you to share with us some of the insights of your work of many decades in Indonesia.
Thank you, Séverine, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually with all of you. So I thought what I would start by doing is giving a bit of a context to this question of indigeneity and indigenous people. It's become a global category. It's reflected in United Nations resolutions and so on. People recognize it, but I believe that the iconic site of indigenous people that is widely recognized does in fact come from the Amazon. So that's why it's wonderful to be in dialogue with Lea today. When this category travels, though, especially to Asia and to Africa, which are not white settler colonies, it becomes rather less obvious, like who is indigenous and who is not. What you have is multiple ethnic groups, often hundreds of different languages, but it doesn't divide neatly into the indigenous and non-indigenous. Nevertheless, people in Africa and Asia have found lots of affinities with the global indigenous movement. And so what I want to try to do is to give a little bit of, some way of how we can understand what indigeneity means in places where it's not an obvious social and political and cultural category. So in these kinds of contexts, I would suggest indigeneity has become what I would call a positioning. It's a position that some people find themselves in when they are placed in what one could call a colonial situation. So if you are a villager in some part of Indonesia and your land is in process of being occupied by a corporate plantation or a timber concession, or you're in the process of being dispossessed to make way for a dam or a mine or something like that, you've been placed in, what one could think of as a colonial situation, and also in an indigenous situation, in the sense that you are now, defenseless, or at least struggling vis-a-vis large-scale forces which are threatening your access to land, your society, social institutions, and so on. So that kind of scenario, what one could think of as David and Goliath kinds of scenario, where communities find themselves faced with facing off against enormous powers, often wielded by their own governments and by corporations. That's the point at which I would say they find themselves having a lot of affinity with groups in the Amazon, for example, who've been facing this kind of situation for centuries, or certainly and speeding up with the expansion of agriculture, logging, and ranching, and so on in the Amazon. So there are points of affinity, but it's not an obvious bit. So what I would like to do now is just take you very briefly into two places in Indonesia where I've conducted long-term field research as an anthropologist, kind of close to the ground research, to give you a sense of what indigeneity kind of looks like, and specifically some of the land questions that people have faced. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully it will work well. Voila, share. Are you seeing my screen share? Okay. So this is a picture of Sulawesi, a corner of Sulawesi taken from Google Earth. And what you can see is a very rugged landscape. So it's not a riverine landscape. The Amazon is rugged, it's mountainous, and people live in this narrow coastal belt along the coast. But there's thousands of people living in these mountains who have, in their own view, lived there since time immemorial. They are the original people. They have the concept that they they're the first people of the world. Their ancestors originated there from a clump of bamboo. So very much a kind of an indigenous origin story. They don't believe they've ever come from anywhere else. They come from there. These are some of the houses that some people are still living in. And this is a house of the kind that many Highlanders from this area aspire to. So many of the Highlanders that I came to know are of the opinion that they have been neglected by the tides of development. Their government has failed to provide them with roads, access to schooling and healthcare, things which they think are normal and proper for Indonesian citizens. So their claim is not so much to protect themselves from forces of modernization which threaten them, but rather more for access to what they regard as the kind of some of the facilities of a modern life. And for them, especially important is schooling and literacy for children, healthcare, and so on. So this is the kind of aspirational house, one could say. And this would be an example of some of the aspirational goods, people who would like access to TV and videos and, things which some people would criticize as being kind of shiny and inappropriate, but which make sense to them as, in terms of the kinds of participation they would like to have, in national and global culture. This is a picture of a young couple farming a cash crop. So like most Indonesians, for centuries, actually, they've long been involved in cash crop production. This couple is planting shallots. there's no roads in this area, so things are carried down to market on a shoulder pole like this one. These are the new crops coming into the highlands, which I describe at length in my book, Land's End. This is cocoa. Highlanders started to plant this crop because they thought it would give them an increase in income and something more stable than their previous cash and food crop production. Their rice and corn, their subsistence foods, are very vulnerable to El Nino drought cycles. So they felt that their previous life was precarious, in fact, in terms of food and access to cash. And they were hoping that cocoa would be the magic that would give them a more stable life and access to some of the things that they wanted. So in order to make this conversion of their land, they are involved in, relations with the spirit world. This is somebody preparing a tray of offerings to the spirits of the earth and the water. They do ceremonies like this on, whenever necessary occasions, including on occasions when they cut down trees, right? They don't have the view that every tree is sacred. It is true that some trees have spirits in, but if you need to cut down this tree in order to make a farm, then what you do is you organize a ceremony and you politely invite the spirits to move to a different tree so that they can be happy and have what they need, i.e., food to eat and a tree to live in, and humans can have what they need as well. So a sort of pragmatic relationship, one could say, with the spirit world, which doesn't preclude clearing forests for the purpose of agriculture. And this is a scene in one of these houses, and one could say that the aspiration of these young mothers is that their children should survive. There's very high mortality in the mountains, and also that they should, when the time comes, own a pair of shoes and go to school, as simple as that. So that's one kind of scenario I've been studying, where you could say that the issue is not a resistance or a rejection or a refusal of a modernity, but actually a desire for access to it, which does not mean that anything goes. Right now, I want to take you to my other research site in Kalimantan, where the set of forces is entirely different. And this is the one driven not by small-scale farmers trying to produce crops for the market and make a better livelihood, but driven by corporations intent on grabbing huge areas of lands in ways that actually bring virtually no benefit to the local population. So that's the kind of David and Goliath situation which fits much more readily in our kind of images of the problems of development in the Amazon as well. So this is the crop, or this is the product, palm oil. Indonesia produces half the world's palm oil, and it's found in half of all the products in global supermarkets. Most of it, though, goes to India, where it's sold as an affordable cooking oil. This is a plantation. You can see massive scale, monocrop, linear design, roads and trucks. This picture is of palms which have been injected with herbicide to kill them, so that a new generation of palms can be planted underneath. So this is clearly an industrial landscape, and the indigenous villagers in this area were actually horrified at this, what they saw as a disrespectful attitude towards nature and towards these palms that had given so much for 30 years, producing profit for the company, but were then sort of callously injected and killed. This is the mill where the palm fruit are crushed. And this is an important picture for me because what this shows is this is a remnant hamlet. This is a hamlet where the indigenous people of the area, Malay and Dayak people, live completely surrounded by corporate company-owned palms. So they've been left with no land at all, and they are stuck in this tiny little enclave, as they call it, really dependent on the company, which may or may not give them work. No guarantee at all that they will be employed there, but they've lost their means of survival. So that's what I would call an indigenous situation, which is quite recognizable in the idioms of the global indigenous movement. And this is just a map to show that in that district, which is the subject of my new book, which I've written with an Indonesian colleague, Pujo Sumadi, called Plantation Life, And the white areas are the remnant areas where people can live, and all the rest has been blocked in by not one, but a whole series of plantations. So, and I'm just going to stop sharing here. Yeah, so that's what I wanted, just to give you a sort of a brief scene setting for the kinds of places, the kinds of people, the kinds of issues that my work has been engaged with. Clearly lots of transformation going on in both cases, but I would say its dynamics are quite different. The one rather driven by a kind of bottom-up desire for more access to consumer goods, education, healthcare, and so on. The other among people who actually thought they were doing fine until a corporate land grab occurred and left them with nothing, right? So quite different trajectories as well. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much. I think they're two very different models of development or conceptions of development. Lea?
Thank you, and hello to all of you. It's wonderful to be still here on this live stream. And I must say thank you so much to Tanya for that insightful sharing. And it sort of took me back a little bit to my experience at the Amazon Synod, in that I spent 3 weeks with environmentalists, professors, people with PhDs and all of this, and I was the youngest there and the only English-speaking Indigenous woman there at the Synod, listening to all these, arguments, counter-arguments, environmental versus the church and all of these things, and trying to make sense of it. So I also really like your sharing of the setting that's there. I felt like it's similar to my home. So a lot of it, the people even look similar, the way their houses are with the palm leaves and all of that. It's pretty much the same thing here. So I am a Wapichan person, Indigenous person. I have lived in my little village all my life, attended school here and then went on further. And here about 90, a little more than 90, let's say 95% of persons here are farmers. And that would not be anything like for commercial purposes, it would just be subsistence farming. So that's how we grew up, that's the way we live. If you have to find anybody who has like a job that pays a salary at the end of the month, that would probably just be a handful. You can count them like on one hand or just two. That's how it is. So when we say we are like completely dependent on the land, it's not a figure of speech, it's quite literally, because that's where we get our food from and everything else. So we live in the savannah, quite close to the forest. And we were living in the forest before the church came. And the church was the one who actually brought the school and the other things, healthcare and so on, that came eventually to our villages here in South Rupununi, in this very remote part of Guyana where I live. And so with that, it also shifted us out of the forest, right? To be able to build a church and to build some schools and to set up some health posts and so on. So with it, it also brought a shift in thinking. So now people had to send their children to school. We had church to go to once a week. And the clothes that we are now wearing, a lot of things began to change. And this was only 100 years ago. So the Catholic faith came to my village in 1909. So it's just, and to my actual place last year, we celebrated our centenary celebration of Catholicism coming into our village. So fairly new. And so a lot has changed since then. And when COVID came in March, when our country was shut down, a lot of it, it actually brought us to reflect on how our life was back then versus now. Because one of the very first things that happened was everybody went back into the forest and their farm camps to live versus in the village where we have access to offices, the hospital, or the school. Because when we reflected on our lives now, because we all live here together, we reflected as like, what was keeping us in this village all the time? And there are two main things, the church and the school. And once that is removed, there's nothing else that needs to keep us where we are currently, right? And now that's really interesting when some people are asking us what help can we offer and all of these things. Many persons wanted to like send food hampers and and where can we find the people? They're nowhere in the village. Where are they? And the answer is we are back in the forest where we have our farms, we have enough to eat, and there is nothing else that we need to actually come back to the village, except maybe for a few basic items that we need to purchase from the shops and so on. But other than that, not really. So that was like a revelation, something of what COVID brought in to show us that nothing much has changed in that sense on our dependency, self-sufficiency. And it's one of the reasons I'm actually happy to be in lockdown here in my little village, because when the borders were closed, people are not allowed to travel, to go out and in and all of these things. We are still living happily. We still have everything we need then, because what we need is in the forest, in our farms and so on. So that's something I wanted to share to begin with. And also, I also work with the Quality Bilingual Education Program for Wapichan children, which Severin mentioned earlier. So in Guyana, the Indigenous people, we are 9 groups in Guyana. I just belong to one of them, the Wapichan people. And we have been fortunate to have our lands legally recognized now after a very long process. But we do have that. But what we realized a few years back was, while we were busy trying to secure our lands, to have it titled so that it can be legally recognized and we can live here without so much of a fear or anything, that this is our land, is recognized by the government. What we realized that we were not paying attention to the other part, which would be the social part, what was going on with us as a people. So while we were there for our land and everything, which is super important, we were neglecting the other side, which was the people part and the welfare of the people, what was going on with us as a people, slowly losing our language, our culture. Where were we heading as a people? So a few years back, we had a series of meetings and events that eventually, coming out of there, people thought that we want to keep our language and culture alive, and we want to continue this way of life. But how are we going to do it? We thought we would do it in the schools. So the school, while it had brought us so much good, it had also brought this negative side where many of us who went to school were not allowed. My parents were not allowed to speak their language in school. They were literally beaten for speaking. And this just happened like 30 years ago, 40 years ago. It's not that long ago. And so that's one thing people said, this is what we want. And the other question is, after fighting so hard for this land, which we say is ours, and we belong to it and we love our land and so on, who will be looking after it in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? If not the same children who are being currently schooled in, let's call it a Western way of thinking, that you need to make money, you need to, that there is this only one way. You work hard for yourself and you be successful, rather than for the community and all that. So we reflected on all of that, and that's one of the reasons I actually became part of this group of the Quality Bilingual Education Program, because while we are so busy with our land, what is going to happen to us as a people. So that's the point where we are, and we believe that if we are empowered enough to make decisions for ourselves, because at this moment it's not us who are actually making speaking up on our behalf and so on. And it's mainly because who am I actually to be speaking like with ministers or governments or these big companies when I don't understand the language they speak, quite literally as well. The terms they use or the things that we have to sign, how will we understand this? So from the synod, one of the young Indigenous leaders who had actually caught my attention was one of the lawyers. And he said that my father fought against these companies with the bow and arrow, but now we have to fight them with a book. So that's why he was studying law, right? So I just wanted to share that as we begin our talk, and just to give a little maybe background as to how I live and where I come from and where we are heading. So I will just end here, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lea. It's very moving, your story, and I think there are quite a lot of differences between the two contexts. And I just want to ask both of you if you can say a bit more about the relationship between the education and the state. Because of course, we cannot compare the state in Guyana and the one in Indonesia. I think the one in Indonesia could be seen as a predatory state, as we say in development. But what is the kind of process of facilitating these positive experiences? And is there a way for the positive experience, the hopeful experience that you are going through in southern Guyana? How can that inspire initiatives in Indonesia? Are there some hopeful initiatives that could be described, and what is the role of religious leaders? Have the Dutch played a very different role in the colonization? And you mentioned, Tanya, the settler colonies, and how the colonial rule is still having an impact on the nature of the state today. So can you see a bit more about that?
Sure. Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so the language situation is quite different from the one that Lea is describing. In Indonesia, all education is in Indonesian language, the national language, but local language traditions tend to be retained in regions and families, so that most Indonesians speak 2 or 3 languages. They speak Indonesian in school, it's the language of school and government, but local languages are generally not dying out. They tend to be lively and retained in families and communities in every region of the country. So perhaps not every tiny language, that I don't know, but in general, there isn't the same issue that Lea mentioned of Indigenous languages being deliberately suppressed. Her parents being beaten for speaking their language. This doesn't, as far to my knowledge, this doesn't happen. Children learn to speak Indonesian in school, which they and their parents value because it gives them access to government, to the economy, and to mobility, and to everything else, which requires, being able to speak the national language. But they're quite confident that their home languages, the 1,000 that there are, will continue. So I think that's part of a different history. I would say that it's not positively supported in the way Lea's describing, with kind of deliberate bilingual education, but nor is it deliberately suppressed. So it just kind of seems so far to be mainly continuing as a kind of, just because people prefer to speak their Indigenous languages, and they do. And this is true also in Java. It's true in the centers of government as well. Most people speak one of the thousands of languages at home, not Indonesian. In terms of the sort of the predation of the state, again, it's interesting. It's wonderful that Guyana has legislation for recognizing Indigenous territories. Indonesia does not, or its legislation exists, but it's extremely cumbersome. And you mentioned a really long process, like here too, a really long process, but under highly disputed conditions, because the question is who are the indigenous people? You know, from some points of view, it could be 50 million. It could be most rural people. They speak an indigenous language. They live on their ancestral territory, right? That could be most of the people could qualify for this kind of recognition of their customary land. But of course, the government is completely unwilling to give up its jurisdiction over much of the national, what's claimed to be the national land, the national forest, etc. So there's a lot at stake there in recognizing customary territories. What has happened is the government, both the Forest Department and the Land Affairs Office, have passed legislation to recognize customary communities, but they've defined the criteria very narrowly. You have to be practically a hunter-gatherer to qualify. If you're a villager with a farm producing food and cash crops, educated, multilingual, mobile, like all those things that many Indonesian rural people are, you won't qualify for this special category, that can get their land recognized. So it's a bit of a tricky recognition. Like you say you recognize, but you define it so narrowly that most people can't qualify. So again, the dynamics are quite different from the one that Lea is describing. I think many people would argue that the Indonesian state is still a colonial state, and it doesn't have to do with whiteness. It has to do with an attitude in which the people who rule take control over territory as they wish and consign it to corporations for the purpose of profit, but don't actually recognize the rights of the people to their land. So that you could say it is arguably still a colonial state. The Dutch have gone, but the structure of the state, as reflected in land law, land tenure, and everyday practices of dispossession, is pretty much as it was, actually. Bit grim. Then what do you do, right? You can't just kick the foreigners out, like they've gone. But the form of the state is the same.
Thank you, Lea. Can you say a bit more about that as well? Because there's a question in the box that asked about what was the process. Was there a fight, or was there more cooperation with the government?
Okay, so I'm just checking the question, and the first one, the answer to the first question is yes. Yes, actually, all this time since we were first brought into the faith, the language, the English language, the health, everything. When it first came, we have kept the forest as our farming place until now. It's still the same. Oh, sorry, the other question, were you able to get?
But the process of the land recognition was this fight, or was it much more collaborative? So is the Guyana government more cooperative and is recognizing the indigenous people in a more inclusive way?
Well, it was a very long process. I remember growing up with it as a child, and until I think it was probably like 10 or 15 years back when we had some of the land recognized. So what happened was the lands were demarcated in a way that, so for example, my village, we said that this border is ours, but then the government gave us like a little less, or they demarcated the land a little less, and then they said there's a process for extension. Some communities followed up that extension immediately and were able to, that process immediately, and were able to actually get their extension. Of course, like Tanya mentioned, with good reasons as to why, right? Because many of our persons have been living in the areas that we were claiming for and all of these things, and occupying the land and so on. So some communities went ahead, and others, like my community, my village right now, the sort of challenges we're facing is we are asking for what cannot be considered an extension in the criteria. It would be like 4 or 5 times the actual land that we have right now. And it goes into the a lot more into the forested areas, and where there's a mining company there. So it ends that way. So of course that is proving to be much trickier than the first phase where we went through, where we had the place we were actually occupying, versus where we would go to hunt and fish, which of course is very long distances we go to fish and hunt. So it's not like just a mile or a kilometer away. So that is proving a little more tricky. And I think it has to do something with the mining that is going on there. Of course, that brings income to the country. Mining brings income to the country. So it's a lot harder to say, give us the land and then we control that, when the minerals and so does not belong to us. And that is in the Amerindian Act, which we have. Our country states that it does, even if it's found in our title lands, we do not have the right to access the minerals in the ground. So we do have that problem. And at this moment, the problem, the other challenge seems to be with the company, the mining companies versus the small miners. And I'm going to say small miners, because previously it was absolutely traditional mining, so just the battle and manually and so on. But now it's increasing. So what people are calling small miners are no longer small. They actually have dredges and all of these things. Versus the large company, which of course has larger equipment and all of that. So that is proving a little bit tricky, because the thing is, if the government says yes to the big company, then the small miners will claim that since they live in this area, never mind they're not indigenous or anything, that the small man, so to speak, is not being catered for. However, it is the small miners right now who are actually damaging the rivers, because they are mainly illegally operating. So there's no consideration for any regulation that is there. So that is like currently that's the main challenge we are facing. So the reality is people need to work to get money. That's what they say. Our country needs it. And then the environment is the other one. So the dilemma we're faced with now is, do we say completely no to mining and we want this land, or continue with regulations, and which one to kick out? So that's what we are faced with right now. So it's not all that calm and nice and easy. We have gotten the first step, but to get to the second, it's proving to be a lot more trickier.
Maybe I could just add something here. I think this question comes up a lot in relation to the oil palm plantations as well. So, the argument is, the government's argument and the industry argument is that this is necessary for jobs and development in remote areas. But what I would say, and together with my co-researchers on this, is do the head count. Like, is it, if you look at the number of people displaced and dispossessed who end up in these tiny little enclaves without land and mostly without jobs, and then you actually count up the number of new jobs that are created, first of all, like just the sheer number of jobs lost or livelihoods lost versus livelihoods gains. And then you look at who are the people. So most of the jobs go to outsiders, migrants from other parts of Indonesia, and the local people are routinely, in fact, not employed. So not only you may have a net deficit, you've lost more in the way of livelihoods than you've gained, you've also just transferred them from one group of people to another and left the people whose territory it is, pretty much with nothing, no land and no jobs. And in the Indonesian context, no welfare payments either, right? No transfers. So I think it's an argument that's used, but it really needs to be subjected to very tough scrutiny. You say it's jobs, show us the jobs, show us how many. Let's do a proper balance sheet of what's being lost here, the environmental damage, the downstream damage, and also the question of the future generations. Like that slide I showed of the dead palms that have been injected with herbicide. After a landscape has had, 2 or 3 generations of this massive industrial monocrop production, what's it going to be good for in future? You know, let's say there's a shift in the market, or maybe there's a disease in the oil palm. Huge areas of the country, millions of hectares, have been dedicated to this kind of monocrop production. So the question about the benefits, the purported benefits, I would say, needs some really critical scrutiny. And just one last point, you know, many activists in Indonesia have been looking at things like the taxes. You know, the argument is that the government gets revenue from these things. It turns out it gets a tiny amount of revenue for these things. Most of these corporations pay very little tax, both because the legal rates are set very low, you know, highly corporate friendly, and also because of all kinds of chicanery and non-payment, right? So again, like, but the purported benefits really need to be given critical scrutiny. So I think the questions Lea is facing, you know, around the advent of mining, you know, require this broader view. You know, the short run thing, well, we need development, we need jobs. Well, yes and no. Let's take a real hard look at what is being proposed here. You know, the costs and the benefits and the distribution, and what's going to happen over the period of a generation. Let's have a 30-year time horizon here. Or perhaps a 60-year time horizon, you know, not a 5-year one, in order to really assess, is this the right path of development, or are the risks and losses really extreme?
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. I think we've lost Lea. Is that right, Tim?
Yes, I'm sorry that we've lost Lea. She sends her apologies, but I'm glad that we did manage to have her for most of the event.
Okay, well, hopefully she might come back for a few minutes later on. But what you were saying here, Tanya, about these palm plantations are not even. It doesn't even make sense much economically, because it's the argument that this extractive model of development or natural resource-based model is bringing revenues and jobs, but it is not. And how do you see the potential for changing the narrative? Because we've been talking a lot about the need to change the narrative, that this is an illusion, that this is bringing sort of progress or better living conditions for people. And are there social movements in Indonesia that are trying to build a different narrative?
Right. So I just checked the question box, and one question to me was about a law which is currently being hotly debated and contested on the streets in Asia, called the Omnibus Law for Job Creation. And so, you know, it's presenting itself as job creation, like that must be good. We all know Indonesian people need jobs. But in fact, it's a law to massively deregulate investment in plantations and minings and large-scale projects, which even the Minister of Finance acknowledges produce very few jobs. These forms of large-scale development are not great job producers, actually. You know, they don't employ that many people. Once they're built, you know, they're just not heavy employers. And so there is a social movement that's mobilized. It does involve people involved in the land movement and the indigenous peoples movement, but also environmental and labor groups, because this law is so threatening to so many Indonesians, rural and urban, especially in the kind of poorer and working classes, farmers and so on, that it has produced a rather impressive unified opposition. Nevertheless, the government is steamrolling it through. So I'd say the story is not over, but I agree with the commentator that, you know, this law is significant, and it's great that the Indonesian activists are on it. You know, they are, I've read some excellent analysis of why this is a terrible direction to go in. And, you know, I wish them strength in this struggle, which involves Indigenous people, but is actually a nationwide issue, I would say.
Just have 1 minute left. Just one question. Who is pushing these laws? You know, what are the interests behind it? Are these the big multinational corporations, or?
Studies have been done which show that Indonesia is the third most unequal country in the world after Russia and Thailand. So it's an oligarchic state. So Indonesians are the owners of, you know, the three richest people. I mean, it's incredibly unequal, and it's actually rich Indonesians who are the owners of most of this wealth. Multinationals come in, but they're not the main movers here. And even some of these multinational companies are largely owned or have dominant shareholding by Indonesian companies. So, or by Indonesian oligarchs. So, you know, it's an unholy, or, you know, it's a problematic alliance between government, rich Indonesians, you know, enormously wealthy people, and transnational corporations that see an opportunity for profit. So multiple parties are in on this, and they're a rather tight network, and they are certainly the people who are behind this law. But at the same time, it's being supported by the World Bank that says, well, of course, the company needs investment and development to produce jobs, right? So, you know, you have agencies that, you know, claim to be progressive, actually part of the same set of arrangements. So it's not one party, but it's a tough bunch, all right? And it's not easy to turn that thing around, but the Indonesian people are many, and it seems they are pretty angry about this. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much. That's very fascinating. It's a clear example of how the politics and the ecology and the social are all mixing. Thank you very much, Tanya. I think our time is up, and Lea unfortunately has left us. So thank you for your time, and for those watching us, thank you. There'll be another Down to Earth dialogue next week with Gaël Giraud, who is a French economist, and Alessandra Smerilli, who works at the Vatican COVID-19 Commission about how to reframe the economy. So maybe they will have some hopeful messages for dealing with the massive inequality that we're witnessing and its impact on the environment and on people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Bye.
Bye.